You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom, and welcome to this episode of SLA Insights. I'm Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and we are continuing a discussion of reading fluency, how to promote it, what's involved. I've talked a bit about working memory and simplifying reading text to help with that. And in the most recent episode, I gave a general introduction to reading skills. There are lower level skills and higher level skills. And the lower level skills need to be mastered and automatized in order to fully engage the higher level skills. Now, in this episode, I want to look at the first of the lower level skills more in detail, and that is word recognition. The other two lower level skills are syntactic parsing, which is also called word integration, and the third is meaning proposition encoding. I'll get to those in the next couple episodes upcoming. But for today, word recognition. And this skill is the most important and most involved of the lower level skills because there's this high correlation between word recognition and reading fluency. According to Grabe, who is the reading guru, he says, quote, "Fluent reading comprehension is not possible without rapid and automatic word recognition of a large vocabulary," end quote. So we're moving into issues of vocabulary, although I'm not going to specifically talk as much about vocabulary this time. That's going to be for a future segment. But looking at word recognition, and there are a number of sub-skills or processes that are involved in word recognition. The first is orthographic processing. In other words, the ability to recognize letters and visual word shapes. And again, this is what we do when we learn the alphabet, the letters, the sounds, and how that works. The second skill or sub-skill of word recognition is semantic and syntactic parsing. That is the ability to process the relationship between a word and its neighboring words, what comes before and after, what happens when you put a preposition on it, what happens when you combine this noun with this verb, and so on. A third sub-process of word recognition is lexical access, and that is the ability to process and choose the correct meaning of a word in its context. You can't, since words have a range of meaning, it depends on context. So given the context, what is the best meaning for this particular word? And it's one of the reasons we do word studies in biblical studies. The fourth sub-skill or sub-process is morphological processing. That is the ability to recognize and assign meaning to the prefixes, the suffixes, the derived forms. And this is all the grammar that we learn, looking at how do you parse a word, a verb, a noun. What do you do when you add a suffix? Well, how does that change it? So all of that comes into play with word recognition. And then finally, phonological processing. This is the ability to process the sound of the word. Now, that may seem, again, counterintuitive given that we're reading, and in most cases, reading silently. Why should we have to know what it sounds like? Why should we have to process that sound? And in fact, as a first-year Hebrew student, that was my question. I went in, having taken Spanish, went into Hebrew as my next language learning experience and thought, well, we're just going to be reading, right? So why is this instructor teaching me the sounds of the language? But again, back to Grabe, he says that research has demonstrated, quote, "for a very large majority of words that are processed while reading, phonological activation of the form plays a major role," end quote. And he goes on to say that this is a universal phenomenon and true even of languages like Chinese, where there's very little correspondence between the sound of the word and the characters that are being read, that because the characters have very little phonological value to them. And so the importance of phonological processing, even for silent reading, is very important and is a further rationale for incorporating auditory input in the language reading course. And I've covered input in greater detail last year as part of this podcast series. So the auditory component of word recognition is also very, very important. All right, so now what do we do with it? What are the implications for our instruction? Now that we know, okay, word recognition is very important, and we have these sub-skills that are involved in word recognition, and I'll go over them again quickly: orthographic processing, semantic and syntactic processing, lexical access, morphological processing, and phonological processing. Well, all of these have to be automatized before a reader can move on to the more complex processes involved in reading, like interpretation, or what we call in biblical studies, exegesis. And so it's really important that first-year courses cover word recognition and do it well, covering, as I mentioned earlier, the alphabet, vocabulary, also I mentioned earlier, and the importance of vocabulary learning. But keep in mind, not just for rote memorization, not just those flashcards, as helpful as they are, but to be able to understand those words in context, to be able to read a sentence and go, I know what that word means in that context. Even though I have 5 potential definitions or glosses, in this context, this is how it works. Morphology, and again, not isolated morphology, not just memorizing a paradigm, but helping the students to make form-meaning connections in the context of a meaningful sentence or a meaningful discourse in the language. And then finally, the sounds of the language, which are often discounted in an early course. Well, you learn the alphabet, you learn what the letters mean, let's move on. But it really is very important to get those students processing the sounds of the language correctly so they can see it and hear it as they're reading internally. And again, this is another thing that I observed in my first year Hebrew language course. The first semester, I noticed as we were taking turns reading and translating our passages that the ones who were reading more accurately, who could make the sounds and reproduce the sounds because they were hearing them and they understood the phonological nature of the word, those were the students who were getting better grades and were translating better in class. So first year courses, this is really important to get these skills down, and again, to do them in context, in the context of meaningful reading, rather than just rote memorization. For one thing, it's more interesting, which makes it more motivating. And then also, it's just more effective. The more you can do language learning in the context of meaningful text, reading, even conversation, the better and more deeply you're learning the language. The next point I have, just to finish things off, as important as word recognition is, it is only one lower level skill that has to be mastered for reading. And sometimes our courses get stuck on word recognition. We forget that there are other lower level skills, and again, I'll be covering those in upcoming episodes. And we forget, sometimes entirely, the higher level skills. We forget that words are made up of phrases, and sentences make up paragraphs, and paragraphs make up discourse. And we get stuck atomizing the text and forgetting that there are other reading skills that need to be developed in order to put it all together and to interpret. And so I would encourage you as teachers, yes, make sure those lower level skills are mastered and automatized, but don't stay there. Continue to push your students on to syntactic parsing, to interpretation, to moving on into those higher level interpretive skills. So, in conclusion, word recognition is our first lower level reading skill. It includes orthographic processing, it includes semantic and syntactic processing, it includes lexical access, morphological processing, and phonological processing. Now, with the other two, this skill, word recognition, along with the other two lower level skills, it has to be mastered and it needs to be automatized to move on to higher level skills. This means not just oh, I think I know what that means. Let me look it up in a dictionary. It means I see it, I know it, I'm moving on. So next episode, I'm going to start covering the next lower level skill of syntactic parsing, building on what we've learned here with word recognition to what happens when we start putting words together into phrases and clauses. So I hope you can join me for the next episode. In the meantime, have a great week.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.